Nuclear fission is a process of splitting an atom in two, during which large amounts of energy are released, which can be used to generate electricity. One of the main advantages of nuclear fission is that it produces fewer carbon dioxide emissions when compared to fossil fuels. These carbon emissions contribute to climate change and the rise of sea levels, which will cause 150 million people to be displaced by 2050, and are also a detriment to the health of the general public, causing thousands of deaths every year. A major hurdle to investment and expansion of nuclear power is public perception, as nuclear power can often be seen as unsafe, largely due to nuclear accidents that have happened in the past. A study from 2016 shows that the majority of the American public oppose nuclear power, which can be attributed to concerns over energy prices, the damaging mindset that there's an abundance of fossil fuels, and a worry of nuclear disaster. However, nuclear power is not inherently dangerous, and any major accident, such as 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or, as will be discussed, Fukushima, can be attributed to human error, design oversights, and a lack of rigorous safety protocols. Therefore, given its numerous benefits, nuclear power is not a resource that we should shy away from. On the 11th of March 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake, the fourth largest earthquake recorded since 1900, was triggered off the east coast of Fukushima, Japan. The earthquake was followed by a 14-meter tall tsunami, which wreaked havoc on the Fukushima coastline. One of the worst hit areas was the Daiichi nuclear power plant, which was damaged in the tsunami. The quick work of the government and the Tokyo Electric Power Company, otherwise known as TEPCO, the company that owned and operated the Daiichi power plant, meant a worst-case scenario was avoided and many lives were saved. However, radioactive material was still released into the atmosphere when steam from the reactors was vented to reduce pressure inside the reactor to prevent an explosion. The Daiichi nuclear power plant was not the only power plant along the Fukushima coastline. The Daini nuclear power plant lies on the coast 12 kilometers to the south, and the Onagawa power plant lies in the north in Miyagi. But, unlike the Daiichi plant, both were undamaged in the tsunami due to sensible decisions made by TEPCO executives during the construction and operation of their nuclear power plants. This leads to the conclusion that nuclear power is not inherently unsafe, but that the Fukushima plant went into meltdown due to poor decisions by TEPCO executives. One of the first mistakes that TEPCO made regarding the Daiichi nuclear power plant was removing some of the natural defences that the area had against tsunamis. Official documents from 1967 show that TEPCO, during the construction of the Daiichi nuclear power plant, made the decision to reduce the height of a nearby cliff, which provided a natural seawall, from 35 metres to just 10 metres. A former TEPCO executive said that the decision was made because reducing the height of the cliff made it easier to deliver heavy construction equipment to the site, as much of it came by sea. A smaller cliff also made it easier and cheaper to pump seawater to the reactors to cool them when operational. Furthermore, it was believed that typhoons, not tsunamis, were the biggest threat to the nuclear power plant, and typhoons in the area produced waves that were no more than 8 metres tall, meaning that a 10-metre tall cliff would provide sufficient protection. TEPCO also constructed a man-made 5.7-metre tall seawall, which was a height that executives believed the largest tsunami could be, despite internal reports from TEPCO engineers stating that the Daiichi site could be hit by tsunamis of up to 10.2 metres tall. Unfortunately, these reports were dismissed as many TEPCO executives thought that the figures presented were unrealistic. The lack of foresight and negligence by the executives at TEPCO meant that the Daiichi nuclear power plant had insufficient protection from any tsunami. In 2012, TEPCO announced that they could have done more to prevent the disaster, but had failed to implement enough safety measures. A worry the executives had was that implementing these safety measures would have attracted media and public attention, highlighted the potential dangers of nuclear power, created paranoia in those living near the power stations, and given momentum to the anti-nuclear lobby. This could have had the potential to create widespread opposition to nuclear power, which would have been against TEPCO's interests. Furthermore, implementing safety improvements, such as extra cooling systems or multiple generators, would have forced the plant to temporarily close, which would have cost a significant amount of money, as TEPCO would lose 100 billion yen, which is approximately $835 million every year for every idle reactor. TEPCO also stated that they did not give sufficient training to specialist staff in disaster response, and saw safety drills as nothing more than a formality. Furthermore, TEPCO continued to operate the Daiichi plant for 2 years without repairs after an inspection found that a piece of equipment had become cracked, which is an obvious safety risk. Authorities knew about the issue, but didn't force TEPCO to shut down the plant and perform repairs. It's possible that the accident could have been avoided if TEPCO had implemented sufficient sea defences, along with other safety features, such as backup generators. The result of the disaster was that radioactive material was released into the surrounding area when the reactors were vented to prevent an explosion. Despite the necessity of venting, this was still a risk, not only due to the radiation, but because the vented gas could cause an explosion when mixed with oxygen in the air, which could further damage the reactor. The Daiichi nuclear power plant uses a boiling water reactor, where water is heated by radioactive material, in this case uranium oxide pellets held in zirconium alloy tubes at 75 atmospheres, which raises the boiling point to 285 degrees Celsius. The steam turns a turbine, which generates electricity, and the steam is condensed and recycled back into the reactor. However, if the water were to boil off, such as during an accident, it will create large volumes of water vapour. This can react with the zirconium alloy tubes to create hydrogen gas, which could still be dangerous as it could ignite and explode when it comes into contact with oxygen in the air. However, due to the actions taken by those at the power plant, the minimal amount of radiation leaked into the surrounding area, potentially saving thousands of lives. After the Daiichi accident, public opinion in Japan turned against nuclear power. A 2005 poll by the International Atomic Energy Agency showed that 82% of Japanese citizens favoured the construction of new nuclear power plants. But polls from 2011 show that between 41% and 54% of Japanese citizens supported the reduction or removal of nuclear power in Japan. This trend is not unique to Japan, but can also be seen in other countries, such as the USA, where there was a drop in nuclear power approval from 57% to 43% between 2008 and 2011. There was also low support for nuclear power in other countries shortly after the accident, such as Chile at 12%, Thailand at 16.6%, Australia at 34%, and the UK at 35%. Even in France, where 3/4 of its electricity is sourced from nuclear power, the majority of the public, at 57%, supported the abandonment of nuclear power. Other polls from 2011 from Japan show that up to 80% of Japanese citizens supported scrapping the nuclear industry altogether, despite many people accepting that Japan had to rely on nuclear power due to a lack of fossil fuels located in Japan, causing Japan to have a self-sufficiency rating of just 6% in 2014. Similar polls also show that over 80% of citizens didn't trust TEPCO or government information on the disaster. A lot of this public reaction is due to the fear that another similar accident will release radioactive material into the atmosphere, which can cause cancer and death. However, compared to the amount of radioactive material released into the atmosphere from decades of nuclear testing, the amount of radioactive material released from a nuclear accident is minimal. For example, the testing of nuclear weapons at the Semipalatinsk test site in the former Soviet Union exposed the public to far larger doses of radiation than any nuclear accident, such as Fukushima or Chernobyl. Furthermore, the United States tested over 900 nuclear bombs in the Nevada desert, just 65 miles from Las Vegas, between 1951 and 1992, despite the large amounts of civilians put at risk. Soldiers stationed in the area were 14% more likely to die from leukemia and 20% more likely to die from prostate or nasal cancer when compared to those not in the area. And the testing also put thousands of tourists to Las Vegas at risk. While it's understandable that people don't want more radioactive particles being released into the atmosphere, it seems as though those making that argument fail to realise that everyone alive today in Europe, Asia and the USA has been in contact with radioactive material from nuclear testing, so the increases in the risk of cancers is negligible at best and minimal at worst. A study done by the University of Arizona estimates that the United States government is responsible for 340,000 to 690,000 American deaths between 1951 and 1973, largely due to Americans drinking milk from farms located near the test sites. It's estimated that children living on farms near high fallout areas were exposed to as much radiation as was found at the Chernobyl accident. In the worst affected areas, the radiation levels were the equivalent of receiving a chest X-ray every year, which is more than what is suitable for infants and pregnant women. Compare these stats to a World Health Organization report that states that, for the general population, both inside and outside Japan, the risks of health complications due to the Fukushima disaster are low, and that there are no observable increases in cancer rates. For those living in the most contaminated area, it's estimated that there is a 4% increase in solid cancers in females exposed as babies a 6% increase in breast cancer for females exposed as babies, a 7% increase in leukemia for males exposed as babies, and up to a 70% increase in thyroid cancer for females exposed as babies. Aside from the increase in risks for thyroid cancer, the estimated increases in risk for cancer are not particularly severe and will lead to fewer cases than those caused by nuclear testing. Furthermore, this data only applies to the area directly around the Daiichi nuclear power plant and not elsewhere in Japan. Elsewhere in Japan, the rates are much lower, with no increase in the vast majority of locations. Therefore, fear of radiation, when considering the history of nuclear testing, is no reason to prevent investment in nuclear power, given the environmental and health benefits that it provides. Nuclear power has the potential to save millions of lives if it replaces fossil fuels, due to the lack of greenhouse gas emissions that a nuclear power plant emits. A World Health Organization study has estimated that the increase in greenhouse gases since 1990, largely due to coal, oil, and gas power stations, resulted in around 150,000 excess deaths in 2000. Most of these deaths were in countries where the rise in greenhouse gas levels can be attributed to an increase in floods, malaria, diarrhea, cardiovascular diseases, and malnutrition. Further stats show that per terawatt hour, emissions from coal power stations kill over 470 times as many people as nuclear power stations, and emissions from oil power stations kill over 350 times as many as nuclear power stations. Furthermore, there are over 1,000 times as many serious illnesses from coal power stations and over 731 times as many from oil power stations when compared to nuclear power. Stats from the UK from 2001 show that 85% of all deaths, 84% of serious illnesses, and 94% of all minor illnesses caused by air pollution from electricity generation can be attributed to coal-fired power stations. Other stats state that, between 2003 and 2013, outdoor air pollution due to the burning of fossil fuels caused over 1 million deaths worldwide annually. On the contrary, between 1971 and 2009, it's estimated that 1.84 million deaths were prevented by nuclear power due to the reduction in greenhouse gases, and an average of 76,000 deaths were actually prevented every year between 2000 and 2009 due to nuclear fission. Between 1971 and 2009, nuclear power only caused 4,900 deaths, 25% from occupational accidents, and 70% from cancers due to radioactive contamination. International Atomic Energy Agency predictions show that between 2010 and 2050, nuclear power can save between 4.4 million and 7 million people from dying due to illnesses and natural disasters caused by CO2 emissions, assuming nuclear power completely replaces fossil fuels. These stats indicate that nuclear power is beneficial to people's health and will save millions of people from premature death. Because of the lack of emissions, nuclear power has the benefit of not directly contributing to climate change and the rise of sea levels. In 2017, a previous executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and other UN specialists said that reducing CO2 emissions significantly by 2020 may not be possible without low-carbon nuclear power. The International Atomic Energy Agency stated that if we are to limit global temperature rise to just 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, we will need to double nuclear power's contribution to global energy consumption. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also found this to be the case in 2018. Nuclear power plants also have fewer emissions than coal, oil, gas, biomass, hydro, wind, and solar by a significant margin. Nuclear power releases, at best, nearly 58 times less emissions by weight than coal, and, at worst, less than half the emissions of wind power. Between 2010 and 2050, assuming nuclear power completely replaces fossil fuels, nuclear power would emit 240 times less CO2 emissions than coal, and 130 times less CO2 emissions than gas in a best-case scenario, and 150 times and 82 times less CO2 emissions for coal and gas, respectively, in the worst-case scenario. No matter what, less CO2 is being emitted, which will prevent or reduce the impact of climate change. If CO2 emissions aren't lowered, it's estimated that by 2050, sea levels will rise between 20 centimeters and 30 centimeters, which will displace 150 million people. In 2014, the World Health Organization estimated that the rise in global temperatures could result in more than 250,000 deaths a year, but more recent figures suggest that the World Health Organization's estimate may be conservative, and the actual amount of deaths may be much greater due to factors like crop yield and food production that will affect everyone worldwide, especially in low-income areas. Food shortages may lead to an increase in 529,000 adult deaths by 2050 and force 100 million into extreme poverty by 2030, which can lead further death through a lack of access to healthcare. Renewable energies also do not directly emit greenhouse gases, meaning that they can also be used to reduce climate change, so should be compared to nuclear power as an alternative. However, nuclear power, in at least some aspects, is superior to renewable energies. Taking wind power as an example, as it has the second lowest amount of CO2 emissions. A single turbine in the world's largest offshore wind farm, the Hornsea 1, generates 7 megawatts, with the entire wind farm generating 1.2 gigawatts. In comparison, the newest nuclear reactors in France generate 1.45 gigawatts. Hornsea 1 cost around £6 billion, whereas one of the French nuclear reactors cost only £1.65 billion. Therefore, if the wind farm was to match the energy capacity of a single nuclear reactor, it would cost around £7.25 billion. This means that the cost per gigawatt for a nuclear reactor is 77% lower than that for a wind farm of equivalent capacity. Furthermore, the saving of £5.6 billion is for a single reactor, and a country would require many reactors. France, for example, has 58 nuclear reactors, so the nation would save £320 billion. This isn't to say that renewable energies shouldn't be considered or invested in, just that nuclear power could be a priority until these forms of renewable energy become much cheaper. Although I have not accounted for the cheapening of renewable energies, nor have I accounted for the construction times for renewable energy farms, which is also an important factor. Furthermore, wind and solar power may be more suitable for developing countries due to the low startup costs. A wind farm can be started with only a few turbines and can be easily expanded when needed, so the cost is spread out over a longer period of time, whereas a nuclear reactor has to be built for an extremely large cost all at once. While it's understandable that people may not want more nuclear power plants in their countries due to fears of nuclear disasters, that fear is unwarranted. The accident that occurred at the Daiichi nuclear power plant can be attributed to poor general decision making by the executives at TEPCO, from the decision to destroy coastal protection to save money, to the decision to not train staff in practical emergency response. The success of nuclear power in many countries, and the lack of any major nuclear accidents in recent years, demonstrates that nuclear power has no inherent danger and will not, nor is it designed to, cause harm to anyone, unlike fossil fuels, which kills thousands of people every year due to its emissions, and are set to kill thousands more as sea levels rise, a trend that the implementation of nuclear power could stop. Therefore, nuclear power should at least be considered in tackling climate change.